More now on Google and the threat of antitrust investigations. In an exclusive Bloomberg story, we learned that Google faces possible probes in Wisconsin and Ohio, focusing on its search and advertising businesses. Joining us now with his take on what happens next is Geoffrey Manne. He is a former lawyer, specialty in antitrust litigation and counseling. He is currently the executive director of a global think tank, the International Center for Law and Economics. Jeff worked at Microsoft, and his organization has accepted money from Google in the past. Jeff, thanks so much for joining us this morning. So the attorneys general from Ohio and Wisconsin are considering probes. Texas is also questioning Google. What is the worst case scenario, as you see it, for Google?
Well, I think the worst case scenario is multiple antitrust investigations and ultimately multiple antitrust enforcement in multiple states, or a combined state action, and then, of course, potentially at the Department of Justice and or the Federal Trade Commission. Both have been investigating Google in various ways. So
it sounds like worst case scenario is basically it's a mess for Google to do business, right? Because you can also have conflicting orders as well, state by state. And then, of course, as you just alluded to, this upping the ante. Will the states just have this drumbeat one by one until it becomes a federal issue and really hold the U.S. Department of Justice feet to the fire?
Well, I'm not sure that I would expect it to appear in sort of every state one by one. I think the history would suggest that, as we're seeing, a couple of states take a pretty active lead on this. Not surprisingly, Texas. Not surprisingly, Ohio. But that's happening concurrently with investigations at the DOJ and, as I said, potentially at the Federal Trade Commission. And I'm not sure that I would say it's the states that are going to induce the federal government to take some sort of action. I think that they are evaluating that possibility on their own right now, and I think that it's probably inevitable, unfortunately, but I do think that the federal government will indeed engage in some kind of enforcement action.
Jeff, we know you worked at Microsoft. I mean, does this just seem like Microsoft Part 2? What are the chances of Google ending up as unhappy as Microsoft was at the end of 1999?
Sure, we have a big, innovative technology company that has managed to produce an incredibly valuable and popular set of products, just like Microsoft, that has attracted, unfortunately, the attention of its competitors. And its competitors, as happened with Microsoft, have gone and complained to governments. In part, instead of competing in the marketplace, they're competing on the steps of the Capitol and the steps of the Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Justice. And I see this being, essentially the same set of facts, and I expect it to play out in somewhat the same way.
Jeff, you have a specialty in antitrust litigation. You do a lot of counseling now as part of your work at the think tank that you founded. In your view, does Google have an antitrust issue? In other words, are the competitors that are complaining, are they right?
Well, those are two very different questions. They do have an antitrust issue because the antitrust laws are very fuzzy, and it is not that difficult, unfortunately, to make a case.
But it sounds like you're sympathetic to Google in this case.
Oh, yeah, I am. Of course, I think the important thing, and one of the nice things about our antitrust laws, are that that it is very fact-specific, and we don't have all of the evidence in front of us yet. But I do think that from my understanding and my research into these markets and the economics and the technology here, what I see the complainants complaining about don't strike me as actual antitrust problems. And what's interesting about antitrust is that it is not entirely a legal matter. It turns on an economic calculus. In order to win an antitrust case,
using dominance in a market to restrain competition and harm consumers, which has to be somewhat tricky to prove, right?
Right, exactly, and it is necessarily a prospective determination. You're asking whether conduct today is likely to harm consumers sometime in the future. it's necessarily speculative, and that's problematic for these innovative and fast-moving industries, because oftentimes what happens is we're evaluating conduct today on the basis of expectations of outcomes today, but by the time those outcomes would have come to pass, the technology has changed so much that the marketplace we're evaluating doesn't look at all like the marketplace in which these consequences are supposed to arise.
So the message seems to be build a successful business, but not too successful. Jeff, thanks very much.
That's always been the claim. Yep. Thank you very much. Geoffrey Manne joining us, Executive Director of the International Center for Law and Economics.